Welcome to Perfectionists Anonymous, a podcast-style channel dedicated to unraveling the myth of perfectionist living. I'm your host, Caitlin, and I'm a recovering perfectionist. I invite you to sit down, relax, and hang out with me, your supportive friend, who knows how difficult perfectionism can be and who wants to find a better way. Thank you for joining me today. Greetings, fellow perfectionists. I hope you are all doing well. Before we get into the meat of today's episode, I wanted to let you know that Perfectionists Anonymous is now available on multiple podcast platforms, including Podbean, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music/Audible, and iHeartRadio, with additional platforms to come soon. You are, of course, still welcome to listen here on YouTube, as this is the first place that new episodes will be released. But if you're looking for a more accessible podcast option, those are now becoming available. So, continuing the trend of things that come up around the holidays, I wanted to talk today about the complex feelings of guilt and shame. Of course, perfectionists and people pleasers and those of us with anxiety are likely to feel guilt and shame at any time of the year, though I sometimes think that these feelings come up even more around the holiday season due to their complexity and how intimately these feelings are connected to our relationships with our loved ones. If you haven't listened to the 3 episodes on anxiety, anger, and sadness, I highly recommend giving those episodes a listen as well, because they are the foundational emotions that humans work with on a regular basis. Those emotions are pretty innate and easy to feel in our bodies. Shame and guilt, on the other hand, are complex emotions that arise from combinations of anxiety, anger, and sadness, and that usually have big, complex stories attached to them. I've also already talked in pretty much every episode so far about guilt and shame, though perhaps not directly. That's because they're pretty integral threads to perfectionistic thinking, and so discussions of them are bound to come up on any perfectionism-related topic. However, I do think it's important to delve into these feelings specifically and isolate them to their bare bones in order to start dismantling them somewhat. This episode will probably be on the shorter side since it is so directly focused, but I think that this breakdown can be a helpful, concrete reminder whenever these feelings arise. I think guilt and shame are often used interchangeably, but really they're 2 separate things, and it's important to note that distinction. We feel guilt when we have negative thoughts about actions that we have or have not taken. For example, we feel guilty when we forget a friend's birthday. We feel guilty when we say something that hurts someone's feelings. We feel guilty when we are late to work. Shame often arises from repeated feelings of guilt. We feel ashamed when we make our actions mean something about ourselves. We feel ashamed when we start to tell ourselves stories about who we are as people and all of the things that we wish were different. For example, we feel ashamed when we think we are a bad friend. We feel ashamed when we think that we are a mean person. We feel ashamed when we think that we are a horrible employee. People who tend towards perfectionistic, people-pleasing, anxiety-ridden thought patterns are usually awash in waves of guilt and shame. Perfectionism itself is rooted in guilt and shame because, as a belief system, it operates from the idea that everything and everyone could always be better, there's always something wrong, and we are always coming up short. When this is your brain's go-to thinking pattern, pretty much every mistake or concern eventually leads down the path to guilt and eventually to shame. It's a cycle that never ends. For example, let's go old school and maybe start with the neutral circumstance that you got a B on a paper. Some people wouldn't care about that grade at all. Some people would be elated by that grade. But most perfectionists look at that grade and think, I didn't get an A. A perfectionistic thought closely follows. A's are better than B's, and you always need to get A's, otherwise you aren't a smart person or a good student. Then come all sorts of feelings, one of which is likely going to be guilt. I feel guilty because I didn't try hard enough on the paper. If I had proofread it more, then it would have been good enough. If I had searched for better sources, then it would have been good enough. If I had just worked harder, then it would have been good enough. And then comes the shame. My paper wasn't good enough, and that means that I'm not good enough. I'm a bad student. I'm never going to be successful. All of a sudden, the neutral circumstance creates a horrible story about you as a person. This cycle replays itself anytime a perceived mistake or transgression is made. Let's do a people-pleasing example, starting with the neutral circumstance that your coworkers ask you to join them for happy hour on a Friday after work. Some people would be perfectly happy accepting the invitation without question, and some people would be reluctant to accept the invitation for a variety of reasons. Regardless of the subjectivity, the people-pleasing thought may arise. My coworkers won't like me unless I go out for happy hour, so I have to do it. Then come all the feelings, including guilt. I feel guilty because I didn't want to go out with my coworkers and I wanted to do my own thing instead. If I was a kinder, friendlier person, then people would like me better and think I'm fun. And then comes the shame. I'm so selfish. I'm so boring. I'm such a bad person. No wonder nobody likes me. Once again, the neutral circumstance becomes an awful narrative about you as a person. Even the most trivial things can trigger this never-ending cycle. Unfortunately, this cycle is also reinforced by the societal messages that we receive daily. In a culture that is always preaching self-improvement and perfection, guilt and shame are supposed to be the emotions that motivate us to always be better. If we feel guilty and ashamed, then we're more likely to want to change things about ourselves. But if we think about this more deeply, it's so easy to see how guilt and shame are absolutely not motivators. When we feel guilty and ashamed, we are a lot less likely to take actions that care for ourselves or others. Taking action out of guilt is usually a temporary thing because you feel forced to do something to avoid feeling horrible. You feel like you should do something in the moment. But what happens when we do things because we feel guilty? Resentment grows and shame festers. And those kinds of feelings are exhausting, not motivating. When we always feel horrible about ourselves because of guilt and shame, then we start avoiding and escaping situations that would make us feel something negative. We have less energy, and we constantly seek validation from others that we're okay. It's not motivating, it's damaging. Long story short, the narrative that guilt and shame are actually helpful has been vastly exaggerated. To a certain extent, feeling guilt is a normal and necessary human emotion that allows us to exist as a species. Healthy guilt can help us monitor our behavior, see how we're showing up, and decide if how we're showing up is beneficial to ourselves or others. Most of us, though, take guilt, feel it way more frequently than is necessary, and turn it into overarching statements of shame that become completely maladaptive. So, what do we do about it? First, as with all emotions, we have to notice how guilt and shame feel in our bodies. Because these are complex emotions, they could have a mix of different feelings, and usually a cognitive thought associated with them. Sometimes guilt is rooted in anger, like, how dare they make me feel like a bad person? Sometimes it's rooted in sadness, like, I'm never going to be able to get this right. And sometimes it's rooted in anxiety, like, if I can't fix this, then everything is going to keep going horribly wrong. It's so easy to skip this step of sitting with the feeling because most of us want to run from it and try to fix it as soon as possible. But if we try to do this before we're truly ready, before we've stopped resisting the feeling, then it won't work. So take a moment, take a breath, and feel your feels. Second, think about why you're feeling guilty or ashamed. Sometimes this is possible to do in our heads, and sometimes a more concrete method, such as journaling or brain dumping, can help. If you're like me, you may have a tendency to focus on external factors that are making you feel guilty. But really, it's our own thoughts that are making us feel so horrible. It can be really hard, but it's best to just focus on the thoughts that we're having about ourselves and not on the thoughts that we're having about others. Once you've identified the thoughts you're having, you can decide if you want to believe the story that your brain is telling you. You can decide if what you're feeling is healthy, productive guilt that you actually do want to do something about, or if what you're feeling is maladaptive guilt created from a story that you don't want to believe about yourself anymore. The difference between these two is entirely up to you. There are no right or wrong answers. As an example of my own work, I used to feel guilty for getting angry and losing my temper at all. I used to think that it meant I was a really bad person, uncontrolled, temperamental, rude, mean, awful. That's shame. And I don't want to believe those things about myself anymore for feeling a very normal human emotion. So I'm currently working on dismissing the thoughts like, I feel guilty for getting angry. I feel guilty for being mad at X person. Because I now believe that it's okay to be mad. It's okay to get angry at people. It's okay to be upset when things feel unfair. At the same time, I might still be okay feeling guilty about yelling when I'm angry, or saying something that I didn't really mean as a way of lashing out. I'm not saying that I objectively should or shouldn't feel guilty for those things, or that you should or should not as well. But for me, that feels like adaptive guilt that may help me show up in a way that feels a little bit better as a whole. And then comes practice. We can't undo years and years of socialization that reinforced feeling guilty and ashamed all of the time in one night. Our brains are really good at holding on to learned patterns for a really long time, and it takes repeated, conscious practice for anything to ever change. This is when it's hardest, I think, because it takes so much patience and understanding to be okay with ourselves learning and growing one little baby step at a time. Because remember, perfectionist brains immediately take anything less than perfection and associate guilt with it. So even when we're trying to specifically dismantle automatic feelings of guilt and shame, guilt is going to come up when we don't do it perfectly right away. More opportunities for practice, I suppose. I also personally get really frustrated when I can't implement these changes in more overwhelming situations as a way to avoid the resulting negativity that usually may come from these situations. For example, in a heated conversation with a loved one, I may start to feel guilty after hearing something they said, but it's darn near impossible for me to pause, feel the feeling, think about it, and dissect it in the moment because words are flying, a response is expected, and if I were to take a break, then I'm not showing up, quote unquote, well enough. It's far from an automatic process. It's difficult to do even in structured, quiet moments sitting by oneself. It's astronomically more difficult to do in an unstructured, elevated, dysregulated moment that involves another person who has certain expectations. As with all things, practice doesn't make perfect, because that's not possible. Practice can make progress, and progress can help deepen the trust that we have with ourselves. That feeling deep inside where we know that we can handle difficult things. We don't have to always show up perfectly, and we can hold compassion and understanding for ourselves. Guilt and shame are powerful, but so are you. Thank you for listening today, fellow perfectionists. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more perfectionism-related content and to help the channel grow. If these episodes are resonating with you and you think they might resonate with others, please feel free to share it as well. Until next time, fellow perfectionists.